Welcome to another episode of CrafterCast, where we focus on specific topics related to modern content management for digital experience applications. I'm Mike Vertal, CEO here at CrafterCMS, and with me today is Russ Danner, our VP of Products and Customer Success. So GraphQL was first created by Facebook in 2012 and released under open source license in 2015. It's currently managed by the GraphQL Foundation, which is part of the Linux Foundation, of which CrafterCMS is a proud sponsor. At a high level, GraphQL is a query language for APIs and a runtime for fulfilling those queries for your backend content and data from various sources. So Russ, let's take that a level deeper. What is GraphQL from a technical perspective?
So GraphQL is a REST-based API that is an alternative to traditional REST APIs that allows you to create, update, and edit data and otherwise interact with your data in the back end, regardless of what technology it's stored in. And that's what really makes this so cool, is that a developer can learn this one kind of API, this one kind of query language, and one method for interacting with data, and then interact with any backend system that is GraphQL enabled.
Right. So what are the rules to follow when you're using GraphQL?
Okay, so let's start with the fact that it doesn't really matter what your backend store is. GraphQL doesn't care about that in any way. GraphQL is a layer on top of that store. So there's a mapping, basically what we call fetchers, that work from the GraphQL interface to interact with your backend store to perform creates, updates, deletes, read operations, and other kinds of monitoring operations. So that's one aspect that you need to understand. Another key component of supporting a query language is that you have a schema, right? So GraphQL has a well-defined schema. On top of that schema, then you have a well-defined query language. And that query language then, as you mentioned, has rules. So the first is that the queries are going to be sort of graph-like in nature, right? That the one object relates to another object in a certain way through a relationship. And also that when we build our queries, the nesting of objects has to be explicit.
Great. And how does it compare to just traditional REST APIs? CrafterCMS, we support both GraphQL and traditional REST APIs. So let's compare and contrast the two and talk about what are the benefits of GraphQL over REST and when would a developer use GraphQL?
So the first is that you have a common way of interacting with the data, that query language. So immediately you can think of the API interface as being something that a developer knows. They can go and browse a schema. They can understand what's available to them. That schema can be an individual graph in one system and an individual graph in another system, or it can be what we call a stitched or a combined graph. So that's another cool feature of GraphQL. You can layer different graphs together. That's part of being a graph type interface. So again, a well-defined interface that's understood by developers. That's a key differentiator. That is the killer differentiator in GraphQL versus other APIs. It's just adoption and ease of use. Another key differentiator is performance. And by this, I mean, if you think about traditional REST APIs, the model is really to have a single API for a given action, let's say a create or a read, and have that for each type of resource that you're interacting with. And what that ends up doing is creating very fine-grained APIs that the client has to make a lot of calls to. And as we know, there's overhead with calls. And so if you're doing a read operation, let's say for products, and you also want content around those products, and you also want inventory information, and you also want, additional catalog or PIM information, this gets to be a lot of different REST calls. And like that granularity has a performance impact. Well, in GraphQL, I can combine all of those queries into a single query, a single question, and get back a response. And further, I can get back just the data that I want. So I make a very efficient call to the server, one call instead of many. And then instead of getting back a huge volume of data, I get back just what I asked for. So there's a big advantage there. Also, if one of those systems adds a new field, in the traditional world, I would have to create a new version of that API because there's potentially a new parameter I might add to support that new field, and there's going to be a new response. So that's a new version of an API. Well, in GraphQL, those types of versions don't exist. That version management of APIs doesn't exist because I had a new field, and existing clients that don't care about that information aren't querying for it, and new clients are querying using that standard query language. So again, a major benefit there in terms of managing your APIs.
Right. Yeah, that's a great example you use for e-commerce type experiences where you've got different back-end systems like for inventory, PIM, product detail information, and CMS combined. But it really applies to any type of modern composable architecture or services-based, microservices-based architecture where you have various data sources, content, and CMS being one of many, and GraphQL can consolidate those queries, right? So that's a great summary of many of its advantages, but as we know, any technology, it's not going to be a silver bullet for all use cases. What are some of GraphQL's limitations?
The first limitation I would say is that there's no inherent security in the specifications. So how whole graphs are secured, how objects are secured, individual fields are secured, and so on. That's all up to the implementation. Another sort of limitation is just limitations that are inherent in the mechanics and semantics of the API. So for example, I mentioned that nesting must be explicit. What that means is that, let's say I have a recursive sort of structure, a product has variations, and those variations have variations that maybe that nests a certain number of times. Well, I need to know how many times that nests in my query because I'm going to tell GraphQL exactly what to return. And if that number is variable, that becomes a challenge for me to model in the query language, right? So there's sort of a limitation there. And what that leads you to is the fact that GraphQL is not always the right API semantics for every job. So just to kind of make that more concrete, I need to know a priori when I make the call exactly the structure of the data that I am going to get back and that I want to get back. And if for some reason I'm trying to make an API call where I'm just asking a question and I'm going to interpret the data that I get back, it's not always clear what the data that's going to come back, what the structure is, then it's probably not the right API for that job.
Great. So now let's talk about it within the context of content management and headless CMS development. What are some of the typical challenges of headless CMS development, and how does GraphQL address those challenges?
Well, I think the way that CMS profits from GraphQL is sort of along the same lines as the advantages we talked about. Number one, finally, you see a common API for getting content from a CMS, regardless of the back-end technology, regardless of the front-end technology, a common interface that's understood by not just CMS developers, but all developers out there who are really interested in keeping up with, modern trends and so on. So there's a high rate of adoption and understanding around that API, and that means that CMS is just accessible and content is more accessible to a wider range of developers and technology stacks and so on. So to me, that's a huge, huge benefit there, and solves a major issue in APIs that CMSs, whether headless or traditional, have always faced, which is just basically standardized integration and so on.
Right.
Another way that it helps is that it gives you some control over what we call the shape of the API, meaning that if I want to structure a response a certain way for a given client, I can do that. I can choose what the fields are called, what objects are included, what fields in those objects are included, and how they're organized to some degree. So it's another major benefit. And a lot of headless CMSs today, that support their own REST APIs, you're creating a content type, and that content type is directly translated to a proprietary REST API format that you have very little control over, and that represents a lot of lock-in to that particular vendor and a lack of flexibility. And I think GraphQL gives you some answers for that problem.
Yeah, that's great. So let's talk about the implementation approach that we've taken at CrafterCMS. How does CrafterCMS support GraphQL, and what are some of its unique advantages with respect to how other headless CMSs support it?
Oh, that's a great question. One of the advantages CrafterCMS's GraphQL implementation has over other headless CMSs is that we have a completely native high-performance implementation of GraphQL. So we've chosen not to bolt on a GraphQL layer that later has to then talk to our APIs in a sort of traditional way, and then talk to our database in a traditional way, because that all we're doing there is making the calls cheaper for the client, but then we have to, that same problem of making many fine-grained calls, that problem then moves inside our platform. We didn't want to bring that problem along and just sort of move it. So what we can do now is take a query from the customer and optimize that query inside of our system in a very efficient way and get back results extremely quick. And that's a huge advantage that we have. Another cool thing that we do is that we have automatic schema generation. So as you create content types, as you modify your content types, we're updating your GraphQL schema for you in real time. So that's pretty powerful. And the last major advantage, I would say, is that our GraphQL implementation is scriptable with Groovy code. So you can write your own fetchers, which makes the platform extremely flexible and very integration friendly. I mean, if you want to support kind of query or kind of operation that we don't natively support against content, you can add it. Or more typically, if you want to marry data from other systems that are not GraphQL, you can create fetchers inside of our CrafterCMS GraphQL interface. Or again, just following along with GraphQL, that ability to layer one graph on top of another. There's several approaches for that. You can create additional plugins to support that as well. So it's a pluggable, scriptable interface, and that offers a tremendous amount of flexibility and power.
That's great. All right, well, thanks, Russ. I think that's a great summary of GraphQL, some of the pros and cons, and why it's important for headless CMS development. So let's put a wrap on this episode. Thanks everybody for watching. If you found this useful, hit the like button and share it with your friends and colleagues. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and so you don't miss any future episodes. And feel free to comment below on any topics you'd love to hear us talk about, or hit us up over at craftercms.com. Thanks for watching and have a great day.